Let's talk about the junior doctors' strike, because junior doctors in England are today stepping up their industrial action in a full 48-hour walkout. Yesterday, they joined consultants for their first joint strike in the history of the NHS. Let's talk to a striking junior doctor, Anna Warrington. Hello to you, Anna. Let's just look at the costs, because NHS providers, which represents health managers, say the likely total cost of the junior doctors' walkouts, which totalled 19 days before this week, will be above £1 billion. How can you justify that cost to the NHS?
I'm so glad you asked. It is, I think, outrageous that the NHS is reliant on private contractors to complete everyday essential services.
Why aren't Labour saying this? But it's come down to junior doctors to literally go on strike to get this message out for people. Finally, Jesus.
Workforce planning, when they slashed successive pay rounds year on year, so that there are too few doctors and nurses to staff the NHS adequately without reaching out to private contractors who can reasonably charge a private contractor's rate.
We'll come on to that specific cost, but I'm talking about the general cost of your walkouts. You seem to be saying that if there'd been more staff to sort of fill in the gaps while you and your colleagues go on strike, that would have been fine. But the £1 billion price tag in general for you walking out, how is that justifiable?
Well, I think it's justified by the strength of the crisis that we are facing in the healthcare service at the moment. I'm not just striking for pay restoration for myself. I am striking for NHS restoration for the public. Every day at work, I see one doctor doing the job of three. I see operating theatres closed due to lack of staffing. The patients aren't getting value for money. The NHS is in crisis. This is due to chronic underfunding, a failure of workforce planning, and a failure to remunerate staffing adequately, and the result of which there simply aren't enough people left to make this service function, in addition to which the buildings are crumbling. The NHS is at the point of total destruction, in my experience at work and in those of my colleagues in addition.
Well,
it's worth investing £1.8 billion of finger-pointing at the government so that they take action, because this is a crisis.
Anna, I'm going to get...
It's so true. It's 100% true. She's right about the public contracting. Because again, loads of the money that we're spending on the NHS is just going into the pockets of CEOs, paying out shareholder dividends for G4S and Serco and Sodexo to do subcontracting work for the NHS, when this could be in-house. We could be paying doctors and nurses properly whilst not paying CEOs and shareholders, and we'd be spending less money, have a more efficient service. The fact that the Landsley reforms, we don't talk about these anymore. They were so pathetic and awful and terrible that even the Tories admit that it was bad. Like the internal market reform, all of this extra financialisation and marketisation of the NHS, it all sucks, it's all bad, get rid of all of it. And it's contributed to the point we're at now, where private companies will cut corners, they'll do things to save money, and they won't do a proper job, and they won't pay their staff correctly, and it's unfortunately costing the NHS both money and its level of service as well. And she's right, the NHS is in crisis, and they need to strike, because otherwise, if they don't raise their pay to such a commensurate level that it would stop them from being headhunted by hospitals in France and Australia where they're getting paid more, then we'll lose the NHS entirely. She is striking to save the NHS, and she's 100% correct to say so.
Go to our guest, but stay with us. I mean, what do you say to that, listening to Anna Warrington, spelling out in apocalyptic terms?
Well, she makes a very compelling case, particularly the idea that the government can spend so much money getting private contractors in to cover for doctors who, from the doctor's perspective, aren't being paid enough. I mean, I don't support strikes. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it massively inconveniences the public, and when it comes to doctors, obviously, potentially puts people's lives at risk.
Justified?
But I don't...
I mean, it's tough. It's your job to stop them from striking. You are the employer. At the end of the day, you're the ones who have control over the contracts, because that's done by the DFH, right? It's your job to stop them from striking by coming to an agreement. And for ages, for months, you weren't even fucking negotiating. You weren't even negotiating with the doctors and essentially goading them into striking by refusing to get round the table. It was only once they started declaring strike action last year that Steve Barclay got off his and decided to get around the negotiating table to try and stop the strikes from happening. And they tried to all try and demonise the doctors, say, well, all this NHS problems are caused by the strike. I'm like, whether it's caused by it or not, the result of the strike is because of your failure on policy, your failure on funding for the NHS. Nobody likes strikes. Workers don't want losing their money. Doctors don't want to not see their patients. Doctors and nurses don't want to see waiting lists increase because they're not at work, but they're forced to because of the absolutely catastrophic failures of the Conservative Party of this country to properly we manage our health service, deliberately so. We've all seen the IEA document, how to privatise the NHS and the way they would go about doing it, and they followed it to a T. They followed all of the methods that they need to be able to defund a service, to be able to remove the ability for it to be able to serve its function, so people call for privatisation whilst it fails, and it still failed, right? They've not managed to demonise the doctors. Doctors still supported by the public. Public ownership of the NHS is still supported by the public, and the public still want the private contraction within the NHS to be taken away. They want it publicly owned, they want it paid for by general taxation, and they want doctors paid properly. They are massively out of step with the public, again, on an economic issue, specifically on the NHS, and they refuse to admit it because they're so blinded by their desire to try and strip as much of it away for their donors and their mates in the private sector as possible.
Don't shy away from the fact, well, it's a much, much bigger debate. I mean, workforce planning and pay is one issue, but for me, the fundamental reform and change of the NHS is beyond urgent, and it should have started years and years ago. And we have this mantra with
you literally tried doing it with the Lansley reform and it made everything worse. The internal market made everything worse. Just get back to a publicly owned NHS without G4S and Sodexo and Serco feasting upon the carrion of the decomposing NHS.
But every single NHS service has to be provided by an NHS organisation, which I think is absolutely ludicrous.
And the Conservatives have been in power for 13 years, and
absolutely.
this is the situation.
And, you know, my Tony Blair started this process with independent treatment centres, put in private contractors to provide routine medical care. If we'd carried on going down that path, I think we would have had a much more efficient NHS. You can't give the doctors a free pass. Their unions can be just as militant as other unions.
All right, well,
good. I hope they're militant. I hope they're extremely militant. They deserve to be, given how appallingly they've been treated by the government as NHS staff. 100%. They should be. They should be militant. It was interesting how he says that Tony Blair started down the road of private provision. And if we'd continued that way, it'd be better. Yeah, we have continued down that way, and it's only gotten worse. Nothing's gotten better since 2010, since you increased private provision in the NHS. And obviously a load of the problems with funding is because of how much PFI debt we're still having to pay off. Thank you, Tony, for that one. On top of the money we pay to shareholders, on top of the money we pay for CEO pay to these private contractors, right? All of that money just gone, wasted on the private sector. The fact that he's trying to say this would be some kind of solution is complete nonsense.
Traditionally hold up as bogey people.
Anna, you were talking about this issue of how much is being paid to doctors while you are out on strike. Here's the headline: £3,000 a shift, how doctor strike cost NHS fortune. People watching this programme will be aghast.
Also, not also costs the NHS a fortune, agency work, having to pay agency fees to fill gaps in nursing because they weren't paying nurses enough, and they cut the nurses' bursary, so not enough people were qualifying as nurses, not enough people were going into the sector, and loads were leaving because their pay was too low, and then others left afterwards because their work requirements were so high because of all the staff that had left because of low pay. Again, deliberate policy from the Conservatives to shift the model.
That is what's being paid out because you're on strike.
I'm aghast as well that the NHS has to pay private contractor rates to meet their essential needs. And this isn't just on strike.
True.
This is on a daily basis.
And is it time to go back to work then? That you and your colleagues to go back to work to stop that amount of money being spent on...
That's a lovely idea. Wouldn't it be nice if we went back to work and suddenly there wasn't a staffing crisis? There's a daily staffing crisis. It's not just on strike days. Every single day of the week there are theatres that are not filled with anaesthetists, so we can't operate. We could put out a rate of £3,000 a day to find one, but there aren't enough of us. That £3,000 rate reflects the maximum hourly rate recommended by the BMA for nighttime work for a consultant. That's a highly skilled individual bearing heavy responsibility at short notice in the middle of the night, and they are a private contractor.
All right.
Think of your locksmith out of hours, okay? We're talking about someone with infinitely more responsibility in their work as a private contractor.
Yes.
It is up to the private contractor what they wish to charge on an hourly basis. The outrage is not the hourly rate of a private contractor. The outrage is that the NHS needs to use them to cover essential everyday services. And that is not on the individual to solve. That is on the government to finance the NHS adequately so that this does not arise.
Alex, is it time?
She's so good. I was going to say I'm sorry for not commenting, not reacting hard enough. But I couldn't say it any plainer than she's saying it. Like, every single time you see a junior doctor on TV talking about this stuff, they're always so erudite. They know exactly what's going on. They have an intimate working of why the NHS is failing. And both the Labour and Conservative parties just look at this stuff and they just does not compute. It doesn't go into brain. Whilst we have the Conservative Party actively trying to destroy the NHS, we have the West Streeting on the other side trying to rip up the GP's contract and going to war with the BMA over it. I'm going insane watching our political class just completely failing to understand like basic functioning of the NHS, whilst junior doctors every single time they're on TV discussing this stuff are so well spoken with their eyes firmly on the prize.
And for Anna and her colleagues to go back to work.
Well, yeah, it is, because this is actually costing lives. Forget the cost of the money to the taxpayer. It is costing lives, and I find that reprehensible. But Anna makes a very good point here, and I think it's worth bearing in mind. And I support, in some respects, the call for medical staff to be paid a lot more, frontline medical staff.
How much
because
more?
It's an international marketplace, right? And if we're not paying them, they're going to go to other countries. How much more? I don't sit there with the ledger of the NHS and know what can be afforded.
No, but I mean, they have asked for 35%
what we should be
increase.
considering instead is looking at ways for an income tax moratorium. Not necessarily a pay rise, but looking at how much these people are paying in tax, hospital parking, whatever it may be. And
Of course, their answer is let's do a tax cut rather than just let's pay these people properly. Although I guess it amounts very much to the same thing because it's money that's being spent by the state regardless. But it's funny that's how the way that she's framing it is having an income tax cut. I guess it's because she wants to try and manufacture the consent for other people to also want income tax cuts as well, but
look into those possibilities. But having lived in Belgium and looked at the European hybrid model of healthcare, which is sort of...
There we go. It's all about getting there to be some kind of insurance model, some kind of private-public partnership on insurance model. Of course, that's exactly what she was going to drive at. I knew she was going to go there. Again, I just want to make it very, very clear for people watching this, because actually, this has been so good. I'm going to put this up as a segment on YouTube. Just to be super, super clear, it does not matter whether you take it all from general taxation or some from general taxation and some from like surcharges or some from an insurance that some people pay into privately, right? All the funding is going onto care overall, and it is fairer. It is fairer for it to come from general taxation rather than coming from a public-private model, because the people who pay the most tax are the richest. As soon as you have some kind of surcharge or some kind of mandatory insurance that everybody pays regardless of income, that is more regressive and less progressive. It doesn't matter where the funding comes from. You just have to do it in a progressive manner, and an insurance system is just less progressive than general taxation as long as your general taxation is focused on the wealthy, and currently it is just, not enough.
Part private and part insurance driven, it works better. And what I find so funny about a lot of people who are going on strike, they say the government's rubbish at running the NHS, but it must remain government run. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Seema?
I would put the strike right firmly at the door of Rishi Sunak. Why is
But
it?
how would you solve it?
Why is
How would you solve it? If the Labour government
It's
comes
got
in
to
next
be
year,
through-
people will say, will you pay Anna and her colleagues 35%?
It's got to be through negotiations. It's got to be through
Well, it hasn't
negotiations.
worked so far, has it?
Well,
Government
why
hasn't
is it?
negotiated, have
Why
they?
is it that Steve Barclay has not met with the juniors since May? Why is it that he hasn't met with the consultants to be in negotiations since March? Why is it that Rishi Sunak hasn't met them at all? When people ask the question about what the Tories are actually doing to be in negotiation and resolve the issues, the answer is really nowhere near enough. And Anna's point is absolutely right. There has been a total lack of workforce planning. Those who, my constituents who love the NHS, who use the NHS, they really value our doctors and nurses, and they know they're under strain.
What would you do if next year you win the election? Tell Anna what you would do as a Labour government to end this strike.
Although this is the crux, right? Again, the Labour Party are being asked to have a real policy rather than just critiquing the government, which is, again, fine. The government, it does need critiquing. It's a terrible government. But unless they can tell us how their response would be, which of course would be, well, we've not seen the papers. We can't promise anything. We have to look at the state of the economy. And as long as it's within our fiscal rules, then we'll try and do something. But we'll at least get to the table. That is what I'm going to predict is going to be her answer.
We have said very clearly that we would absolutely be negotiating. We would be in discussions, because it's in discussions about how we resolve the strike as well as how we plan for the workforce for the long term. And we have said that.
And would you meet their
very
pay demands?
clearly. We have said that we wouldn't be able to meet 35%. We've said that already, because you have to do it within the fiscal framework that you have.
So good at this. I'm so good. I've watched so much of this stuff now. I see through the veil. It's too good.
But what we have said is that we would be in discussions not just about pay, but also about conditions and the need to invest in our NHS for the future. The issue is wider than pay, and Anna has also said
Can I
that.
just say in 10 seconds, the causes of
more
these
than 10
disputes, I've got more to say, and probably
Spin
the
it out,
disputes themselves will still be ongoing if Keir Starmer wins. And that's what I mean about he's got a big call to make, and where there are parallels with the 70s. Those staff shortages being highlighted are chronic and urgent. And when you said to me, maybe people just want it to be kind of the same, but a bit more competent, this illustrates why big change is required. The NHS is on its knees. I know that's a cliche, but that means big, including funding, has to be found quickly, or else, as I say, we're in 70s territory.
But then the funding is never ending. I mean, every time we have one of these debates, people say just put more money into the NHS. It does not.
Well, let's stop putting money into the pockets of CEOs and private contractor dividend payouts and put it into a properly publicly owned NHS. Like, we're paying for things we don't need to pay for.
Not work unless you fundamentally reform how you deliver
But
the service.
it's never ending.
And also worth pointing out as well that the price of generic pharmaceuticals has increased almost twofold over the last 5 years in real terms, which would have been easily solved by having a state-owned generic pharmaceutical manufacturing plant, which was in the 2017 Labour manifesto, because of course it was. But no, we have to pay like top prices from the cartel of big pharma on the continent for our generics, and that will continue to increase.
There wasn't a national strike through the time that Labour was in power. There's a really important principle here, which is how you work with the workforce, with the sector, on planning for the future together. That has been completely missing.
But we now
how the
spend as
Tories
much
have
as our
handled
European
this.
peers. I mean, in terms of the overall spending.
On per head of spending?
Overall, yeah.
Look, well, I mean, Alec, can I just...
As a proportion of GDP, we're kind of middle of the pack. I think we're lower than like Germany, but higher than France in general as far as where we stand in real terms. But again, you've got to understand that lots of that money is going into the hands of private contractors and repaying PFI debt.
We're up there with them.
We're not.
And what's going to Tory
And the big
donors? There are
difference-
major
Briefly.
issues about how money is being spent.
Yeah, but the big difference
Why-
is the funding model in terms of countries like France and Germany.
Yes.
It is not the
And
same
what's
as
going
here.
to
So are you
Tory
saying that
donors?
should change as well?
I think everything should be on the table. I mean, this model does not work.
Right.
What
You've even
contracts are going?
got
It's a lie. He's just lying. He's like, because again, I told you, this is literally what they want to do. They've tried to defund it so they could just come out here and say, look how bad it is, the model does not work. It's deliberate. It's so obviously deliberate for anyone who has like a functioning cortex that this was planned, deliberate. Over time, they knew they couldn't do it outright, privatise the NHS or change the funding model, otherwise there'll be outcry. So they had to manufacture, they had to engineer it, and also at the same time engineer it whilst pumping money into the pockets of their friends. It's so obvious and deliberate, and if you don't see it, I'm sorry, then you just need your head checked. You need a real reality check on what the nature of Conservative politics is.
people like Wes Streeting saying this in the
Shadow
Labour
Health
Party.
Secretary.
So, yeah, I think it's time to have that discussion.
I mean, is
Yeah,
that...
looking forward to Health Secretary Wes Streeting come next year. He's going to be in charge of ensuring the NHS stays alive, so, you know, good luck, doctors. You're going to need it.
the sort of reform you think people want too?
I think there needs to be a forensic look also at the reforms that have taken place, because some of them have actually cost quite a lot of money. It's in a very fractured, confused state. It's very hard to know who's in charge of what.
Oh, yeah.
Partly as a result of some of the reforms that have gone through already. So when I hear that...
Say Andrew Lansley. Say his name. Say the man who's responsible for these garbage reforms. Like, call these people out. The Conservative Party have already admitted that the Lansley reforms were terrible. Call them out.
word reform. It's not a magic wand.
Well,
you have
no.
to look
And it means
very
different things to
clearly at
different people.
Exactly. You have to look
Anna,
at what reform means.
Let me bring Anna back in. Listening to Seema Malhotra from the Labour Party, are you assured, Anna, that you would get a better deal if Labour win next year, from what you've heard?
I'm not assured that the solution is obvious, nor that any political party is in possession of it. But I think several things are true. One is that in this discussion earlier, we were talking about privatised services and how those have not succeeded. And I'm not convinced that we know that privatising any limb of the NHS will result in better value for the customer. If people are concerned about the moral repugnance of doctors charging £3,000 a shift now, imagine what it will be like when it's privatised, believe me.
Well, who's
I
putting
think
forward...
it is morally
Anna, hang on. Who's putting forward the idea that the NHS is going to be privatised?
Well, my understanding is that successive Conservative governments have beleaguered the NHS so that very few alternatives are available. I think introducing market forces into the health service, which was actually completed under Labour, has been extended further by the Conservatives' action to the extent that we find ourselves where we are now. There are private contractors in the NHS that they do charge more, and the NHS has to pay what they charge until the NHS is adequately staffed itself. And unfortunately, because of successive pay cuts to the tune of 35%, mind, remember this is pay restoration, not a pay rise. Right. There is now a workforce crisis that is driving the NHS further into the ground. The public are not getting value for money. Something must be done. I do think that the very least the government could do is come into negotiations with the doctors.
Well, that's true, but let the guests come back and answer some of your points.
I mean, she's so good. She's so good. Oh my God. Again, no notes at all. No notes whatsoever. She's just absolutely smashing it out.
These are the kind of points that sort of make my blood boil. I mean, luckily I'm on statins, which I pay for. So you remember that you do pay for some NHS services. And it is ludicrous to say that you can't have private contractors providing an NHS service, so long as it's free at the point of care, regardless.
Yeah, exactly.
You can have them. They just suck. You get worse care. You get worse value for money, but you like them because your mates get paid out of it. Like the internal market stuff, that's not actually at all in any way led to any kind of positive outcome, positive utility, better result from the health service. In fact, the more we've had private involvement over the last 13 years, the more we've got to the point at which the service has collapsed. But given what I have previously said about the kind of incentives that private companies have, the service that they have to deliver as a government contractor is in no way related to the actual performance that they actually have to give out, because all they care about is taking money out of it, because they don't have any customers who will turn away from their service because they already have a state contract. The private provision of state-owned or state-run services is like the worst model. It's literally the worst model, because you get the worst service and you spend the most money. Put it back in public, put it back in-house.
For your income, why on earth wouldn't you do that? I mean, it just seems completely bizarre. We don't worry about, we regulate our food standards, but we buy our food from private contractors. And this idea, the use of the word privatisation in this debate drives me round the bend, because it basically shuts down debate. The Tories are going to privatise the NHS. What?
You are! That's literally what you're doing. It's what you have done for 13 years. The Red Tories too. You literally done it. We see it in front of our eyes. We know what Serco do. We go into hospitals and we can see hospital porters and you can see the Sodexo on their shirts. We know it's being privatised. Don't act like we're f***ing stupid, you... Jesus Christ, these Tories make me, I'm so angry. Oh my God. I'm going to burst a blood vessel, chat. I hope you realise that there's all the things I put myself through to give you guys fun content.
What does that mean? The companies that make your drugs are private companies. The companies that provide all the equipment in your hospitals are private companies. Why do we say that private companies cannot provide NHS services? It's just ludicrous.
Anna?
Well, I thought that there was some moral affront earlier at the idea that these strikes were costing money because private contractors had to be paid to cover the
That's
cost
not
of
the same
doctors.
argument.
And that is the same one every day of the week. There are private contractors
but they
fulfilling
are
the role.
two, but they are two very different things.
Also, the idea that there's private procurement for commodities in the NHS, as if that's somehow connected to our arguments about private provision of services in the NHS, private ownership of trusts in the NHS by like Centene and Virgin Care. The absolute temerity of this guy to suggest that these two things are in any way similar, like, it's insulting. It's literally insulting to our intelligence. He's so awful. I'm gonna have to do so much editing to the segment though. I hope you know, chat.
So if as a patient I consider it poor value for money, as a doctor I am delighted that some of my pay can be restored through additional work.
I had an independent contractor in my constituency under the Blair government that completely removed all waiting lists for cataracts, driven out by the unions.
And you'd still support that, wouldn't you, Seema?
I want to make this point, which is that
for those that point, you wouldn't be committed to reducing the amount of private sector involvement. As Alex quite rightly said, West Streeting has said, actually, we may be increasing it.
West Streeting has talked about this and having to make sure that we also bring down waiting lists. But I want to make this point because West Streeting has laid out our views on that. But where I have constituents who are saying to me they are feeling forced to go private because they can't access the treatment they need, it isn't just the strikes that have caused that problem. Definitely. And we need to make sure that we've got an NHS that's fit for the future. And that's why our workforce planning, investing in the doctors, the nurses, the district nurses, the health facilities in our communities are absolutely the number one priority for Wes Streeting and for a Labour government.
Anna Warrington, thank you very much for joining us.
Wow,
let's talk about...
Breathe, Helena. Temperature down. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.